Hello, everyone, and welcome to the February panel of the Coaches and Professionals program. This month, we're going to be talking about eating disorder education and having empathetic conversations about performance and nutrition between coaches and athletes. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's one that all of us would benefit from learning how to have. So I first want to introduce our two amazing panelists who will bring such great insights onto this topic. So Megan, if you want to start and introduce yourself, your job title, and why you're passionate about mental health, why you went into this field.
Yeah, so hi everybody. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Megan. I'm an integrative health practitioner, and the reason why I'm super passionate about mental health is I feel like there's so much about it that I feel like is so unknown, but I feel like having these conversations and understanding somebody at a deeper level helps us to start to uncover, different things that are happening within the body, but also help us like put into words what's actually happening in our mind. And I feel like in my practice specifically, I work with a lot of like nutrient deficiencies and gut dysfunctions and things like that. So I take athletes through a better understanding of their body so that way they can replenish any deficiencies and, work to strengthen their mental health. But then it also comes with a lot of lifestyle things as well too. I struggled with a lot of mental health things while I was an athlete at Temple. So just being here and being able to, give back to the athletic community is super special.
Great. We're so lucky to have you. Linda, I'll turn those same questions over to you.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Linda Steinhardt. I'm a sports and eating disorder dietitian. I work in a treatment facility in Denver, Colorado. It's ED care and the athlete program is called the EDGE program. And so I get to work with athletes with eating disorders, and it's my passion. And I think it's so important because, the sports world, athlete world, athletic person world, it has a lot of disordered eating a lot of the time, and I think is in an environment in which it like can kind of cultivate it at times, unfortunately. And so I feel really fortunate to be able to support people in kind of like challenging those thought patterns and beliefs. And I think part of my job too is also to help inform, like, as you were mentioning, like coaches or athlete providers, to be able to kind of like spread that message and to be able to communicate like how it might be helpful to chat with athletes about this sort of a thing, or how to support athletes in getting help too. And I think it can really change the path or the experience of an athlete to be able to exist in a culture that supports their mental health and their adequacy with nutrition and things like that. So it feels pretty fulfilling to be able to do that.
Definitely. I completely agree that athletics can often like kind of foster disordered eating habits and kind of cultivate that environment. So I think it's so important that coaches like learn how to have these conversations and kind of like practice having them before they get kind of thrown into the situation, thrown into the fire, and have to deal with these situations kind of without any prior knowledge. So speaking of that, what are some signs that athletes show when they're not fueling properly that could be kind of noticed by a coach, so the coach may see in their athlete? Linda, I'll start with you if you have any like potential warning signs for eating disorders or disordered eating.
Yeah, yeah. I think depending on if the coach is around when kind of the athletes are eating, if the coach starts to notice that, their plate kind of changes, or they're skipping out on team meals, or they're bringing their own food, right, to team meals that are kind of provided for the team, I think those can be warning signs. I also think even like performance things that people might mention. So I think about things a lot of times in terms of it's called REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. And every system in the body, right, can kind of like compensate if we're not getting enough to eat. So if people are mentioning, I feel like I'm training appropriately, like I'm following the training plan, but my legs are just so tired all the time, or I can't seem to recover, or I'm getting injured more often, or things like that they might report to coaches, I think can be just like, red flags can go up of, wonder if they're getting enough to eat, those sorts of things. Those are a couple of things. I'm curious. Yeah, Megan might have more, but.
Yeah, I wanted to turn it over to you, Megan, to see if there's anything that you would like to add or echo on that, emphasize.
Yeah, I definitely would like to echo on the fatigue aspect of things because I think that's a huge one too, especially if people or athletes aren't like, performing well in their training and they're starting to see drops offs in their performance. I think that's a huge red flag that can be like a warning sign for many coaches. But then I also think too, from just like a mental health perspective, if they're a little bit more closed off and they're just like a little bit more shy and maybe not engaging as they once would. So if you see like a drop in their just overall appearance when they are in practice or around team meetings and things like that, I feel like that's another big sign as well too. But I would say like performance wise, I that would be the biggest one for me as well.
And speaking of performance, would like not fueling properly, it can not only impact it performance, but it can impact like injuries, I'm assuming. Like it's not only just performance, but also can like lead to injuries.
I think that's one of the tough parts about this dynamic, right? Because oftentimes, athletes want to be good at their sport and they want to work hard oftentimes. And a lot of times they might have tendencies like dedication and hard work and they're driven. Um, that, if their performance, let's say, does start to drop off, and maybe it's due to, okay, they're not getting enough to eat, or there's some like disordered eating going on or something like that, right? And they're saying, okay, well, I'm not performing as well, or coach is, asking me about why my times aren't as good or something like that, right? I think sometimes it can get a little bit mixed up, and the athlete might feel like, oh, I got to work harder then, or I must be doing this nutrition thing wrong and I got to tighten it up, right? And so I think sometimes even if coaches notice things like that, right, where their maybe performance is dropping or they're feeling, bad about their performance or something like that, that can even be like a warning sign in terms of, okay, what is the athlete going to do with that? And how do we have conversations around that, to make sure that the athlete feels supported, that it's not just about their performance and their identity isn't just as an athlete, right? It's so much more than that. And also that the athlete doesn't feel like, okay, well, if my performance is dropping, that must mean I need to work harder, eat a different way, those sorts of things. Because I think that can be a slippery slope.
Yeah, and just to kind of like echo a little bit more on that too, like there's so many dynamics and I feel like so many hats that a student athlete wears. They obviously are a student. That's why they're like, going and probably likely performing in sports and things like that. But then they're an athlete as well. They're a friend. So they're trying to balance all these different things. So, when you're kind of thinking about like performance and I feel like the other aspect is like considering stress and just like the considering the overall stress that they're also thinking too. So like from a mental health perspective, it's like, yeah, maybe I'm not performing well and then I have to like overthink my nutrition, but then I'm also like I've got X, Y, and Z also as well too. So just like being a student athlete is like all in all demanding. And I think sometimes like Linda was saying, like sometimes just pushing hard enough harder is not always the best because it creates this more stress in the body, which can make it more easy for athletes to get injured, and then that's creating another layer of mental health issues that are really hard to kind of also work through too.
Yeah, completely. And that leads perfectly into the next question that I had for you both is how can coaches and also support staff, because support staff like athletic trainers and administrative personnel around athletic departments play a huge role in this. But how can they approach these conversations around nutrition in an empathetic manner? I think initially, like initiating conversations is something that can seem very daunting to try and initiate in an empathetic manner. It's uncomfortable, it's awkward for a lot of coaches, and they don't want to overstep. So like what are ways that you think that coaches can kind of initiate these conversations in an empathetic manner? And then, or if you have any examples of how coaches should not initiate these conversations, either way.
Yeah, I can start. I think there's a couple of different things I think about with this. I think if a coach, so two examples I'm thinking of, if the coach has noticed someone who might be struggling and they're not sure how to approach that conversation with an athlete, because that can be hard, right? Like, how do I say, hey, I'm noticing you're struggling, and how do I support them, right? One thing I think about too is the coach saying, hey, this is what I'm noticing. I'm noticing these shifts in terms of, hey, I'm noticing that you're not going to team dinners, or I'm noticing that your plates, like you're shifting kind of what you're eating or ordering or things like that, right? Anything that they notice that are like red flags for them, right? And that might be things that they've learned from the providers that they work with, from the dietitians, from the athletic trainers, from other athlete providers too, right? Because coaches don't have to be the experts on everything. And so they might say, okay, something seems off here. I'm going to maybe consult with people, like other providers that I work with. Does this seem off? Yeah, okay, it seems off. How do I address this? Okay, then go to the athlete and you could say something, hey, I'm noticing this and I want to make sure that we're supporting you in the ways that would feel helpful. And so kind of directing them or referring them to providers that could specialize in eating disorders, disordered eating, whatever they might be noticing, and then making sure they know like that is private, right? That the coach doesn't have to be involved, or that the coach doesn't have to know anything that like might be going on around like disclosing eating disorder symptoms or information, unless it would affect like their safety or their participation in sport, right? But that they know the athlete has a safe space, because sometimes that can feel a little bit hard if the athlete's like, well, is the coach going to know what's going on, right? And so getting them to the proper supports. I think the other situation is if the coach, if the athlete's coming to the coach, right, and saying, hey, I'm struggling with this, same thing, right? Coach provides some empathy, provide some support. Hey, thank you so much for sharing. I really want to get you the support that you're needing. And I want to play the role of like being supportive, and okay, let's get you some support from these like specialized professionals, is I think some things that I think about.
So I really liked what Linda alluded to as far as like getting appropriate information. Like if a coach suspects something, going to a bunch of different other professionals in the space and kind of acquiring information, because it's okay to suspect something, but I feel like you shouldn't just go be like, this is what you have. Like this is this, and kind of pointing the blame game onto someone, because maybe they're just not ready to open up about that. And that can already allow them to feel more closed off. And then they're like, I don't trust you anymore. So I like the idea of like going to a dietitian or going to an athletic trainer and, maybe cultivating more information, so that it's not like, I've been watching your plate and I noticed you haven't been eating. So as much as you can, kind of trying to come at the conversation in a really compassionate way, be like, I care about you. Sport is really just one part of you, but ultimately your health is what you have forever, even after sport. So this is something that I want to, help you with, or encourage you to seek help when you're ready for it. So that way you don't, end up with other things down the line as well too, because ultimately there's the mental barrier with coming to somebody when you have a disordered eating habit, or maybe it's not even something that you're fully recognizing and you're just kind of like really inundated with your routine and things like that. So there's so many complexities. So just being open to getting as much information as you can and providing the athlete with the resources, and then just being like, listen, like I'm here for you when you're ready. We can do this together, or if you feel more comfortable going with someone else or something like that, just trying to find a way that they can feel supported however they best. And everybody's going to need a little bit of a different support system. I think that's the individuality aspect to a lot of these conversations, is that I might want support another way, but somebody else might appreciate support in a different way too. So that's how I would personally appreciate from a professional standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. And as someone who went to a smaller school that didn't have a nutrition on staff, our athletic trainers kind of acted as therapists, every role that you could think of. I guess my question would be, what are some like resources, or if a coach has a concern over an athlete's nutrition, but again are uncomfortable approaching that conversation, like we mentioned before, coaches are not trained in every area under the sun. Like what would you recommend, or how would you recommend they find external resources if there aren't any on their campus? Like if they don't have a dietitian on their athletic training staff, like how would you recommend they find resources in the community?
One thing that I think is helpful that oftentimes like a lot of college campuses have will be like a student health services. And oftentimes those kind of facilities and departments have like dietitians or therapists. They might not be like specifically sport trained, But if they could see like someone that is like eating disorder informed, or kind of aware, and can support the athlete with whatever kind of struggle they're having, I think is important. Sometimes people will refer out to like outpatient providers in the community. So even if, let's say, student health doesn't have that, but they have the resources to be able to kind of like look for appropriate and kind of like qualified providers in the outpatient setting, sometimes that can be an option. I also wanted to follow up real quick on the previous question about kind of maybe some things that like aren't as helpful from coaches to be able to communicate if they're like have concerns, or just in general about kind of nutrition aspects of an athlete's care. I think oftentimes, I've heard from athletes that like small comments coaches make can have really big impacts, because they trust their coach so much, right? And the coach is often who they see like every day, or a lot of the time, right? And so they have maybe like a lot of trust, or a lot of like there's that dynamic there between like, okay, coach might decide my playing time, right? And so athletes can kind of feel pressure there. And so I think any comment about like someone's body, I think is probably like inappropriate, or not helpful, right? And can actually be harmful. And then I think also similar, just like any comment about what someone might be eating, what someone's ordering in a restaurant, or kind of saying, hey, let's make, even a comment as simple as like, hey, let's make sure we're eating quote unquote healthy before the game. That can really have an impact on people, and it can kind of seem benign, but I think the pressures that athletes can feel, right, of I have to do this right, or have to do this perfect, right, can also get transposed onto how they feel that they quote unquote should eat, or quote unquote should look, right? So anything that kind of speaks to food or body in a way that isn't, hey, make sure you get enough to eat, right? Or work towards getting adequate intake, right? I think can be something that can be more harmful than helpful at times.
Yeah, Megan, is there anything you have to add about things that coaches shouldn't approach conversations with, or just way like external resources that they could utilize if they're uncomfortable having those conversations themselves?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like additional things that you shouldn't approach, like it, or maybe it's kind of more like some positive advice. Like, even if you're going, like, you should rarely make comments about what people should and should not do. But if you ever were going to, maybe like kind of backing it up with like, this is why, like, you eat a little bit more protein to like help your muscles recover too. So then it kind of like takes it away from, how you look and like kind of helping you with your performance. But honestly, I would stray away from really making a lot of direct comments about somebody, and just regardless of their eating, unless they're asking for it or you notice a consistent pattern, like just kind of take note of it and then just sort of address it when it feels appropriate, especially because like I don't necessarily think it's super important or super appropriate for it to be addressed like amongst other teammates either, because not only is that embarrassing, but then, like Linda alluded to, like it's shameful. Now I feel guilty. Maybe I won't get as much playing time now, or, whatever the case is. And coaches like ultimately have a really big impact on, a lot of athletes, just because again, they see them so much. So I definitely would stay cautious with that. And as far as like receiving resources outside of like going to, a student health center, like many campuses have for, other students, I might also ask or consider coaches like talking to like the president of athletics, because maybe they have some other additional resources. I feel like unfortunately eating disorders are becoming, or have, been that something that many people have, you know, heard of. So many of them likely are prepared with those things too. And even if they're not, like they can, again, help with sort of that outreach into the community. Or maybe there's another college nearby that has someone that's trained in eating disorder specific like specialties too. So that might be another option for coaches to consider as well.
I think that's a great tip, because now that you say that, it's not something I had thought about before, but like leaning on your colleagues, leaning on your coworkers. I know in my athletic department when I was an athlete, like you never knew who had a background in what, who worked where before they came to the college. Someone had a sports psych degree that I had no idea. It's really, you really don't know everything about everyone. And just asking, you'll learn so much about like what people specialize in, what people have done before they got to where they are now. And people have such diverse backgrounds that you never know who they could be connected with. So I think that's a great piece of advice. Um, so what measures do you think coaches can put in place to help their athletes fuel properly for like performance and just their overall well-being? I know some coaches will try and bring food on away trips to make sure that their athletes are eating and getting nutrition, especially on long road trips, long bus rides, long stays in hotels, things like that. Having snacks in the office and the locker room, like are there any, even if it's not having food around, like are there any measures that you think coaches can put in place to kind of encourage their athletes to fuel properly?
Yeah, I think the culture matters in a team a lot. And I think oftentimes, right, we hear like nutrition messages just in society in general, about like what to eat or what's good or bad, right? Like those sorts of messages. And I think if a message from a coach and really from a team perspective can be, hey, we need to focus on getting enough. Like number one goal, we need to get enough. And I don't think we hear that enough in terms of like the adequacy piece of things. And so I think if a coach, if they feel nothing else about nutrition from the coach, it's that, hey, I need to get enough. Coach wants me to make sure I get enough. And they don't care, you know, what it is or if it's quote unquote good or bad, because that's not a thing, right? We don't have morality around food. But I need to get enough, right? And so ways that coaches can do that, I think if they're noticing, I think one thing that has felt effective when I've worked in collegiate settings is if there's like seniors or leaders on the team that can kind of like make that the standard, right? We don't want to moralize food, like have morals around food in terms of, oh, this food's good and this food's bad. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable eating what you enjoy. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable getting seconds. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable bringing snacks, and it doesn't matter what the snack is as long as you enjoy it and as long as you're eating consistently, right? And if that's kind of like the standard and the thing that like coach encourages and coach backs up, right? And that, you know, leaders of the team kind of set that expectation as like freshmen are coming in, right? And it's like, oh, okay, I guess this is just like what we do, right? Because I think it can be so powerful either way, right? If the kind of culture on the team is a little bit less, it emphasizes either adequacy or kind of like managing or okay, this food is good and this food is bad, I have to be careful, right? And people notice that, teammates pick up on that. And so I think establishing a culture from the get-go is really important as best as coaches can.
Yeah, I love the embracing or like in putting in place a good culture. I think that's super important. The other thing that I think is might be helpful in preparation with these conversations and just things as a whole is if an athlete comes to a coach and they have a genuine question about nutrition or you know whatever the case is, again, try to find those resources. Is it somebody, a colleague of yours? Is it an athletic trainer that has a nutrition background? You know, looking for those resources for people. And you know, I love the idea of like bringing food on a road trip and things like that. But I think that another really big component about an athlete, like another really key characteristic, is that they want to learn more. They want to learn how to be in a better position so they can be better useful for their team and things like that. So how you like perceive their question is also going to really negate how comfortable they feel with you. If you kind of come really closed off and closed-minded to it and don't, you know, receive it in an empathetic way where you're like, oh, I understand where you're coming from and I don't have this information for you right now, but like let me get back to you on that. So I think that's another aspect of things as well, in addition to just again, you know, after weight training, like, maybe it's having a snack in the weight room or something like that already prepared for them. But I think the culture aspect is super key too, like encouraging team dinners, or like after practice, we all go to eat. So then you can kind of see that food is a community thing, and it's not meant to be an isolating thing based on performance. And, like Linda was saying, there's no good or bad. So if you have, a slice of pizza or you have pasta, like ultimately food is fuel, and that's super important from an athletic perspective. So yeah.
Definitely. So I feel like we touched upon a lot of things. So I kind of want to wrap it up with, is there any advice that like didn't kind of come up in the questions that we had prepared? Like, is there anything that you think is really important for coaches to keep in mind, whether that's a word of encouragement or um so be it, that you would like to give to coaches kind of that might not have been touched upon already?
I think I'll share. I think it can be tricky as a coach, right? It's really hard to kind of know what an athlete might be going through, like under the surface, right? Because I think athletes oftentimes want to present really well, like they want to say, I'm ready to go, coach. Totally, I'll do whatever you say, and that can be part of like helpful coachability, but it can also be at the expense of their mental health or their physical health at times, right? And so I think being able to kind of like upfront as a coach, again, kind of set the expectation of like, hey, you're more than an athlete, and we show you that by, okay, you can come to us as you feel comfortable and able and ready to. If you need a break, or if you need to talk about something, like, we will get you support. We can have those conversations. Um, and I think in that same vein, that like, we can't make assumptions about what an athlete is or is not going through. So even if they're coming to practice and they seem super happy, right? I think we can't make assumptions always. And so it's helpful, I think, to kind of check in, or to make sure, again, that like the culture is one of like, hey, teammates are checking in on each other. And that they know if they need support, like they can speak up. And I think easier said than done, right? In terms of like creating a culture where all athletes would be like, oh yeah, I'll come if I'm struggling, right? But I think being aware that like what we see or what we observe in practice, there may be more to the story than that. And so just being open to the idea that that could be possible for some of the athletes on their team right now. So I would say that.
Yeah, and I think what Linda was saying about like checking in. Like, I know something that's worked really well for me through my athletic career was having the ability to check in with my coach and, kind of talk a little bit more like off the record when there weren't other people around. And, the other piece of advice I think that's important with mental health, eating disorders, like no matter what the case is giving the ability, or opening for the ability to adjust training in a way that makes sense for this one season of life. Because that's the hardest thing, I think, sometimes for an athlete to admit. They're like, hey, like, I'm dealing with this thing, everything feels like it's weighing on top of me like a ton of bricks, and I don't really know where to start. um Perhaps the coach can just like adjust mileage or adjust the intensity of practice a little bit more, depending on where they are in the season. But I think a lot of that comes from the athlete just feeling comfortable and feeling like they're in a safe space, whether it's with the coach, or, if it's with a dietitian or another like wellness professional on staff, if they have the ability to do that. I know a lot of campuses are kind of branching out more, which is great, but I know even just smaller campuses don't have that ability. So yeah, once a week check-ins if possible, and then just being open to like being a little less rigid to training as needed.
And how powerful is that, right? Like, to be able to, I think about sometimes, right? Like, athletes can get really disconnected from their bodies in terms of, I'm feeling one way, but I got to present like another way. I got to just do this workout anyway, because that's what practice says I got to do. Right. And it can be so empowering to say, to acknowledge, like, I'm not feeling well, and actually engaging in this level of training or this workout today would not be appropriate for me. Right. And to be able to like validate like internal experience and be able to respond to that and say, hey, yeah, this wouldn't be appropriate for me, or I need to kind of modify training this week, can be so connecting, right? Instead of disconnecting. And I think that's so important. I meet with so many athletes who maybe transition out of sport, um, who have that like reconnection work to do. And they recognize how disconnected they might have been from their bodies within their sport, right? To no fault of anyone's. But that, sometimes that happens. And I think, as Megan was saying, it can be such an impactful experience to have those check-ins, to be able to voice, hey, I am feeling kind of off. Oh, and there's something we can do about that, right? We can support you in saying, hey, we can change training to kind of match what would be helpful for you this week, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and just to like kind of compound on that too, like I know I said this like a little bit earlier, but athletics are like a really big part of many athletes' life. I feel like that's their identity, and that's obviously another conversation surrounding mental health as well too. But ultimately, like your health is your health as well too, and continuing to pursue things and learn how to disconnect when needed is like such a valuable skill to take on, years after, sport isn't something that is like part of your main life as well too. So, when I'm working with athletes, I often like to say like, listen, like we're going to get you here right now, but like ultimately the strategies that you put together for you are going to be useful for after sport as well too. So that way you don't have to be like, I'm in this one mode all the time kind of thing. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Definitely. I think those are amazing parting thoughts for our coaches and professionals that are listening. So I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Before we end, I want to ask if coaches and professionals are interested in receiving more information from you, or just more information about nutrition and like proper fueling in sports. If you would like to share your contact information or a resource that you think is really valuable, we would love to hear it.
I can go first. I'll share my email. I think that's probably the best way to reach me. It's my first initial and then my last name. So L Steinhardt, Steinhardt at eatingdisorder.care. So that's my work email. I work at a treatment facility. So also I'll just share, if any coaches that are listening, or any athlete providers have athletes that they think might benefit from a higher level of care. So we have partial hospitalization and intensive outpatient program that's specific for athletes. And it's called ED Care. It's the EDGE program in Denver, Colorado. So they can also reach out to me with any kind of questions or thoughts about that.
Yeah, and for me, my work email is Naroznowski, Naroznowski at my infinitewellness.net. And like I said before, I'm an integrative health practitioner, but we also work with a lot of dietitians that are specialized in eating disorder recovery too. So we take a better look at what's happening inside the body to identify other imbalances, while also working with a dietitian just to make sure nutrition is on par there. So they're certainly able to reach out to me there as well.
Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate all the wonderful information that you provided, and we're excited to share this with everyone.